Ginny awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside her cabin window. She smiled and reached out for Paul sleepily, touching the rumpled sheets beside her. She opened her eyes and saw that she was alone in bed. She sat up and pulled the curtains open. Warm sunlight streamed into the room. As she turned, she saw a note from Paul, written in lipstick, on the mirror. It read, "Beware of bears." Grinning sheepishly, she got out of bed. Well, she had tried to tell him, but he hadn't given her much of a chance, since when he had finally stopped to take a breath, she was much too turned on to care. He had always affected her that way. It wasn't that he was such a terrific lover, although there was certainly nothing wrong with the way that Paul made love. While they were doing it, he always concentrated on her, on the emotions they were sharing. He focused on the feelings that were washing over them, instead of concentrating on his technique, as so many guys did, because they were anxious to perform well. She never understood why guys often got so hung up on the mechanics of lovemaking, rather than the pleasure of it. Why reduce something wonderful to nothing more than mere physical exercise? Why remove yourself from the experience of genuine intimacy? How the hell could you possibly be involved with what you were doing while computing baseball batting averages or doing multiplication tables in your head? She had once gone out with a music major who seemed so preoccupied during their lovemaking and so rhythmic in his movements that when she pressed him to talk about it, he had confessed that he was concentrating on the scores of various complex classical arrangements by composers like Paganini and Scarlatti. At first, she couldn't believe it, and she thought that he was joking, but he was absolutely serious. He confessed to her that he had worked out a system whereby various composers were classified according to different stages of the love-making process. Debussy was helpful during foreplay. Wagner, he claimed, was very effective right near the end. She got even with him one night by waiting until just the right moment, then reaching beneath her pillow for her stereo remote control. She blasted him with a tape of Twisted Sister. He left scratch marks on the ceiling. Mercifully, Paul wasn't anything like that. Whenever the two of them made love, he was there with her, completely, 100%. And it was like that when they did things together, too. He wasn't in the slightest bit intimidated by the fact that she had as much endurance on the trail as he did, could run faster, or had a higher IQ. Instead, rather than resent her for the things she could do, he enjoyed the way she challenged him and spurred him on to try new things. Whatever they were doing, whether it was tennis, riding a bike, or running a marathon, they engaged in play rather than competition. They complemented each other very well. She wondered if she were really getting serious about him. She hadn't thought that she'd be ready for that yet, but lately she'd been thinking that maybe the key to success in love wasn't necessarily finding the right guy, but recognizing him when he came along. Otherwise, she thought, you might be so busy looking that you could miss someone really special who was right under your nose. She got dressed and went down to the main house for breakfast. It was Terry's turn to cook this morning, according to the chart they'd made up, and she certainly wasn't skimping on her responsibilities. She had gotten up early and had the biscuits in the oven by the time everybody got there. Ginny arrived to the wonderful smell of fresh baked biscuits mingled with frying sausages and something Terry called scrambled Denver omelet, which consisted of scrambled eggs with little pieces of ham, cheese, peppers, and onions mixed in. In return for the excellent breakfast, they all voted to excuse her from KP for the remainder of the day. After breakfast, they gathered in the living room over coffee, and Ginny gave a talk on child psychology, with tips on how to deal with homesick campers. They followed this with a general discussion on how to handle problem children whose parents packed them off to camp just to have them away from home all summer. Then they exchanged horror stories about problem kids they had run into during summers past and how they had dealt with them. Jeff told a story about two rotten-tempered little boys, brothers who had driven him nearly insane one summer, always yelling and screaming and fighting with each other. One time, he said, they'd gone at it in the camp's recreation building, and they had a war with billiard balls. It was a miracle no one was killed, he said. He himself had a narrow escape when one of the little bastards hurled a pool ball right between his legs. "What did you do?" said Scott. "I decided to immobilize him," Jeff said. "I stuck him in 2 wooden chairs, placed back to back, and then I lashed them down, tied them to each other. I figured they could just sit there and scream to their little heart's content until their throats were raw. I left them that way for 3 hours. They quieted down some after that. I always carry handcuffs myself," said Ted. "Handcuffs?" Ginny said, feeling that she was starting to lose control of this discussion. This wasn't exactly the sort of child psychology she had in mind. "You actually use handcuffs?" "You can buy them in any police supply store or magic shop," said Ted, with a perfectly straight face. "Or one of those kinky places where they sell leather, you know. Those places are good because they've also got these black leather hoods that lace up from the back, you know. So you can't really see anything. There's just these little holes for the nose where they can breathe. Even the mouth is covered. Keeps them from making too much noise." Ginny stared at him with horror. "You know what else is good?" continued Ted. "They've got these belts that go along it as sort of an accessory, with these studs and rings on them. Only the studs are just for decoration, really. Although I guess they'd hurt if you got hit with them. But the rings are the thing, see? Because you can take a length of chain and run it through the rings, then loop it over the handcuffs and lock the whole rig down. And the little buggers can't hardly move at all then." "Ted," said Ginny, unable to believe her ears. "My God, you can't do that to little kids. What would their parents say?" And then she saw the grins on their faces and heard the snickers, and she blushed as she realized that they'd been kidding. "Same old Ted," Paul said with a chuckle. Ginny threw a sofa pillow at him. Following Ginny's session, Paul took over and mustered everyone outside for a cross-country run, during which it quickly became obvious who the smokers were. Mark, who was excused from the run because he couldn't propel his wheelchair across rough country, sat at the side of the path, near the start and finish line, yelling encouragement. He laughed as he saw Jeff bringing up the rear, gasping and panting hard. "Hey, what's the matter, Jeff?" he yelled, clapping his hands. "Come on. The women are showing you up." Sandra was leading the race. Jeff stumbled by, out of breath, giving Mark the finger. After the run, just when they all thought they were going to get a chance to rest, Paul announced that they were going to walk it off on a nature hike. And with a collective groan, the counselors embarked upon a hike down one of the lakeside trails. "Try to stay on this trail," Paul warned as they passed in single file down the narrow path that ran along the lakeshore. "There's a lot of poison ivy here." He pointed out the 3-pronged plants. "After lunch, we're going to do some more running." There were more miserable groans. Ginny brought up the rear to make sure there were no stragglers. Paul had told her that he wouldn't put it past some of these kids to hang back until everyone else was far ahead. and then double back to the cabins where they could gold brick. So Ginny was making sure that everyone kept up while Paul set a good, steady pace up front. She saw Terry's little dog, Muffin, go tearing off into the trees, barking furiously at something it had seen there, and for a moment Ginny hung back, looking in the direction that the dog had gone. She had never seen the dog respond like that before. Something felt strange. She squinted, trying to see through the thick woods, but she couldn't see anything. Muffin had disappeared somewhere into the bushes at the side of the trail. She shrugged and continued on. It was probably only a squirrel. Still, for some peculiar reason, she could not shake the feeling that there was someone watching them. She hadn't said anything about it to Paul, because he'd probably just laugh and claim that his fireside ghost story had gotten to her, after all. There was no way she could explain it to him. She simply sensed something nearby, something vaguely disturbing. She suppressed an involuntary shudder and hurried to catch up with the others. He stood hidden in the trees and watched them pass by, oblivious to his presence. Deep within his simple, twisted mind, a cold fire began to burn as he watched them disappear from sight. He knew who these people were. They were just like the others, the ones who had hurt him so long ago, the same ones who had hurt his mother. Jason Voorhees was insane. The violent things he'd seen and the savage life he'd lived out in the woods had their irreversible effects upon his feeble mind. But those things had only completed what nature had started. He had never been completely normal. Strange forces had been at work in his life from the very moment of his conception. From his premature birth at the stroke of midnight, one Friday the 13th, there had been something different about him. It was not only that he had been an unusually large infant with striking, pronounced features that gave him an almost adult expression, but there was something ominous about him that filled all those who came near him with a profound sense of unease. All except his mother. A mother loves her child. Pamela Voorhees never had a chance to make it to the hospital. Her labor had been unnaturally short, as if the child within her were trying to claw its way out of her womb. The doctor had arrived just in time to deliver Jason in the bedroom. Even from birth, Jason was curiously silent. When the doctor held him up and slapped him, Jason didn't make a sound. For a moment, the doctor was alarmed, thinking that the child might have been stillborn. He slapped Jason once again, a little harder this time, again with no response. And then he noticed that the child's eyes were open and staring straight at him with an astonishing expression, one that almost seemed like cold, venomous fury. It staggered him to see such searing hatred in the gaze of a newborn child. But that surely would have been impossible, and he decided that it must have been only his imagination. Yet, for months thereafter, he dreamed of those loathsome, hate-filled infant eyes. Even as a child, Jason was unusual. No one ever saw him smile. He never gurgled with delight at the birthday-colored mobile that was hung above his crib, or at the toys that he was given. He never screamed when he needed to be changed, and he never displayed no reaction whatsoever when his first teeth came in. He acted as though he didn't feel the pain. He never woke his mother in the middle of the night with crying, sometimes feeling the anxiety that every mother of a newborn child feels. Pamela Voorhees would awaken at night and tiptoe to the baby's room just to reassure herself that there was nothing wrong. She would look down into the crib and see her infant Jason lying on his bed, his eyes wide open, staring at her. He never made a sound. For a while, she was afraid that there might be something wrong with him, that perhaps he was autistic, one of those tragic children who were withdrawn into their own secret, silent world. But Jason was not withdrawn. He noticed everything. His reactions were unusually quick and sharp. He was incredibly alert, and his senses were remarkably acute. He grew strong quickly, and he never became ill. He had no playmates because the other children avoided him. They seemed to be afraid of him. They ran away from him and complained about his creepy eyes. In truth, there was nothing at all unusual about his eyes, except for the fact that, like a cobra, he never seemed to blink. The neighbors could never really explain why, when they were walking back from the train station after riding home from work, they always crossed to the opposite side of the street whenever Jason was outside playing. It was as if some involuntary reaction had taken hold of them, some primal instinct warning them away. As commuters who worked in the city, they understood the subtle instincts that were at work. In a city full of predators, you learn to trust your feelings, and they had some very strong feelings about the little Voorhees boy. He made their skin crawl. It wasn't something they openly admitted to themselves, because it would have sounded silly, and it made no sense. But irrationally, it was there. It felt profoundly disturbing to be near him. He baffled all his teachers, although he affected a few of them much more strongly. One of them abruptly quit her job and moved away from town. His third-grade teacher, a shy young woman, offered her body to the principal if he would only move the boy out of her class. And a school psychologist who had tried to reach him wound up being reached himself and had a breakdown. The poor man was put into a straitjacket and taken to an institution. It seemed that something strange happened to everyone who came near Jason Voorhees. All except his mother. A mother loves her child. She was always hovering near him protectively, always ready to defend him. She had wanted her son to experience the pleasures of a summer in the woods, and so she had taken the job as cook at Camp Crystal Lake, just so she could stay near him. Only, as it turned out, she wasn't able to stay near enough. She was beside herself with worry the night he disappeared, and when his clothes were found by the lake, Pamela Voorhees went berserk. It had been necessary to restrain her and take her to the county hospital, where she was sedated. Although they never found the body of the boy, the official verdict was that it was death by drowning. Pamela Voorhees never recovered from the shock. Jason's memories of what happened on the night he drowned were very dim. He remembered being frightened as his legs cramped up, and he started to slip beneath the surface of the lake. He had a vague memory of struggling to stay afloat, of water rushing down his throat and filling up his lungs. He could recall the terrifying sensation of sinking down into the murky lake, the fading light, the roaring in his ears, and then nothing. At some point, consciousness returned, but he had no way of telling how much time had passed. He came to on the shore, covered from head to toe with mud and slime, apparently having dragged himself out of the lake somehow. He coughed up water for a very long time. He remembered laying in the bushes and retching, vomiting up slimy worms and maggots as his body fought its way back to life. It never occurred to him to wonder what it was that made him different from the others, why they shrank from him as rabbits shrank from snakes. He never asked himself why he was always healthy, why the slight injuries of childhood had always healed so quickly. He had never broken any bones, so no one ever had the opportunity to notice the supernatural way his body could repair itself. Pamela Voorhees never questioned it, just as she never questioned his peculiar silence. A mother loves her child. She was simply grateful for having been blessed with a healthy little boy. Like father, like son. It did not occur to Jason Voorhees to wonder just how long he had been underwater. He merely dragged himself deeper into the woods, some primitive urge driving him to find a hole somewhere that he could crawl into, a dark place where he could rest and heal, and wait until he could think of what to do. After a while, he returned back to the camp, his simple mind telling him that perhaps it was what he was supposed to do. Only there was no longer anybody there. The season had ended, and the camp was closed. He broke into several of the cabins and found some cans of food and some old clothes for himself. In the process, he happened to catch sight of himself in a mirror, and he recoiled in horror from the image that confronted him. He had been at the bottom of the lake for much longer than he realized. His flesh was trying to regenerate and heal itself, but decomposition had set in. The worms had eaten at his face. He fled into the woods, terrified of his own reflection. After a while, he found a sack and cut some holes in it, then put it over his head and tied it down around his neck so that he wouldn't have to see the grotesque thing he had become if he saw his reflection in the lake. He had no idea what to do or where to go. He wondered why his mother didn't come for him. He was afraid to leave the vicinity of the camp, for that was where he'd seen her last, and he didn't want to miss her if she came looking for him. He didn't want to get in trouble. He lived like an animal, hiding in the woods, avoiding people, killing small creatures for food. He was vaguely aware of time passing, though his days became an endless succession of wandering in the woods and foraging. He was aware of feeling cold as winter came. He took shelter in the cabins at the camp and huddled before fires he built inside the hearths. He had learned to make fires in camp, though several times he did it wrong and let the flames get out of control, burning down a couple of the cabins before he got the hang of it. On occasion, a policeman would drive by and see smoke curling from the chimney of a cabin that was supposed to be locked up for the winter. He would stop to investigate, but Jason always ran back into the woods whenever anybody came. He was waiting for his mother, and he did not want to get in trouble. He knew she would be very angry. And then, one day, his mother had returned. Some people had come to open up the camp again, and he had run off into the woods, hiding from them and watching as they rebuilt the place. Years had passed, and he was now full grown, though still with the mind of a small child. But whatever vestige of sanity might have been left in that childlike brain had been driven out by the hardships he had suffered and by the sight of his mother, mad with grief, embarking upon her bloody murder spree. He had been afraid because she had seemed so angry, He had hidden in the woods and watched on that fateful night when Pamela Voorhees had unleashed her vengeance on those whom she blamed for her son's death. She had killed them all except one girl, and Jason had watched her struggle with the last survivor, Alice. He had seen that awful moment when the girl had picked up the machete his mother had dropped and swung it with a savage desperation. He would never forget the sight of his mother's decapitated body falling to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut, the stump of her neck spouting arcs of bright red blood, her head falling to the ground like a ripe melon, rolling several feet and then stopping, the eyelashes still fluttering as it lay upon the ground. When the girl had pushed off from the shore in the canoe, he had hesitantly crept out of hiding and approached his mother's body. He had stared down at it incomprehendingly, at the vivid red of her blood soaking into the ground, at the raw, torn flesh, and the white bone where the machete had chopped completely through the neck like an axe through a small sapling. He had knelt down and picked up his mother's severed head, holding it tenderly so that the sightless, death-glazed eyes looked up at him. He had stared out into the darkness of the lake, looking in the direction where the girl who had done this to his mother had gone. And whatever fragile links his tortured mind still had with reality had snapped like the neck bones of little forest creatures that he caught and killed for his survival. The girl named Alice had escaped him once, and the fury of his frustration knew no bounds. But then she had come back, and he knew that he had been given another chance to make things right. He had spotted her that day when she had returned to the camp. She had stood at the lakeshore near the boat dock, staring out over the water. She had returned to the place where her nightmare had happened, to see it once again, to confront it, and to reassure herself that it was over now, and that there was nothing left to fear. When Jason had seen her standing there, the lust to kill had welled up within him, burning like napalm in his mind. He had started for her, but before he could reach her, she had gotten back into her car and driven off. Fueled by a grim determination, he had followed her on the road back to the town of Crystal Lake, staying out of sight, waiting until night fell. Each night thereafter, he had stalked the streets of Crystal Lake, always keeping to the shadows, looking for her car. He had always taken his mother with him, carrying her decaying head inside a sack so that she could be with him when he did it, so that she would know that he was doing the right thing. Then, one night, he had seen her car parked outside an old Victorian house that had been converted into several apartments, and he had seen the open window. He had killed her, punching the ice pick through her skull and driving it deep into her brain. And then he had taken her body with him back to the cabin in the woods, carrying it over his shoulder and slipping out of town like a grisly specter in the night. For a while there had been peace. The rage had gone away, and the hunger that had clawed at him like a ravenous animal left him alone. He had stayed with his mother in the woods, and for a while he had been happy. They were together. He had done the right thing, and he knew she would be pleased. Yet now they had returned once more, the same ones who had hurt him, the same ones who had hurt his mother, and he knew that there would be no more rest for him until he killed them all. He had to do it. It's what his mother would have wanted.